Good morning and welcome to Morning Movie News, where, in honor of Halloween, I have prepared an episode for you full of scary stories. But unfortunately, because of the place Hollywood finds itself right now, most of them are sad but true. But we're going to start with a fun one. We don't want to be all doom and gloom today, and that's that Pet Sematary is coming back. Yes, hot on the heels of it becoming a global phenomenon, the kind that makes a lot of money, which is what Hollywood is interested in. They have decided that, of course, they want to try and repeat that success. One person takes a risk, and then everybody else dogpiles on. That's the Hollywood way. And so their first inkling was that Stephen King was super hot, right? But then, of course, Dark Tower bombed, although Akiva Goldsman, he's actually going to factor into this story as well by the time we get to the end of it. But then even on Netflix, they bet on Stephen King with both Gerald's Game in 1922. And while it got some attention, it didn't get like It level attention. So Hollywood was like, okay, clearly it's more than just Stephen King. It has to be Stephen King and something that was successful the first time around. That has like that, the nostalgia factor, which is really big right now. For instance, Jurassic Park came back, right? So we're kind of going for that. It, of course, playing off of the very successful television miniseries. So what's another popular Stephen King adaptation that's available? We'll get to The Shining, don't worry. But Pet Sematary is around, and Paramount has the rights to it, and they have decided to aggressively move forward in the wake of it with bringing that back to the silver screen. Yes, Pet Sematary was a big hit, at least the first one. The second one, not so much. But the first one came out in 1989, and it was not only a big hit in theaters, but it was a very big deal on the ancillary market. Back when the ancillary market fueled Hollywood. They remember those days fondly. I have a friend who works in the business, with access to those numbers, and he's pointed out to me that even though digital is where people consume home products now for entertainment, it just does not bring in the same revenue that VHS and then DVD sales once did. So that's a huge revenue stream that's missing from Hollywood these days. And don't kid yourself, that affects the business as well. But Pet Sematary, it did really well in the ancillary market, which is, VHS DVD sales, playing on airplanes, etc., television sales, and all that. So, it's one of those rare Stephen King successful hits. Because if you look at his track record, his projects actually don't make a ton of money. So anyway, Pet Sematary is a potential It copycat, right? So Paramount, which we've just discussed on Movie Math yesterday, they're having a lot of trouble in the awards sector with Mother and now Suburbicon. They were trying to copy Netflix, they said, and they seem to be looking over a lot of shoulders. I put that in my notes, because now, of course, they're looking over Warner Brothers with It. So they were interviewing a bunch of directors, and of course, the other hot new thing to do right now is to find an indie director and have them take their indie voice and apply it to a blockbuster and make a quirky blockbuster, because audiences, I think that the mainstream audience's tastes have evolved. They want a little something interesting, and of course, Taika Waititi is currently delivering that with Thor Ragnarok. You have the bad example like Lord and Miller with Kathleen Kennedy in Star Wars, but then of course, we don't know how that film would have turned out. Who knows who was right, and we'll never know who was right in that scenario. But Paramount for Pet Sematary has picked the directing duo of Dennis Widmyer and Kevin Kolsch, who did the 2014 fantasy horror film Starry Eyes, which nobody's heard of, but apparently it made the rounds in Hollywood. And they've also directed off of that a couple of episodes of MTV's Scream. So they're waiting for their big deal. And we'll see if this is it. It's a roll of the dice when you get these indie directors. Sometimes they can deliver a Jurassic World. Sometimes they do Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Men Tell No Tales did quite well overseas, but I don't think anybody was like, man, that directing was out of town. It was the Kontiki directors. So this film is Pet Sematary, the remake, is going to be written by 1408 screenwriter Matthew Greenberg. And of course, 1408 was another Stephen King adaptation, the highest opening for a Stephen King adaptation before It came to town. But It opened with like over 100 million, and 1408 opened with 20.6. Quite a discrepancy there, right? But if you make Pet Sematary cheap, it would be nice if it did It numbers, but it doesn't have to. Anything even a fraction of that would be much appreciated by Paramount, particularly these days. But I think the real success, if you want another It, of course, is the Shining sequel, Doctor Sleep, which Warner Brothers has the rights to. Oh, Warner Brothers. And that's the Shining sequel where a grown-up Danny is having his own problems, and he goes back to the Overlook Hotel to manage it himself. And if they can get Jack back, right, and he's still working, he's going to do a remake of Tony Erdmann with Kristen Wiig. So he's still available for the right project, and I think the right paycheck. So if I were Warner Brothers, I would task an executive with their sole job is to get one of those great Hollywood stories, right? Your sole job is to get Jack Nicholson to agree to do Dr. Sleep. Although Akiva Goldsman's been hired to do at least hopefully the first draft of the adaptation. I don't know why, particularly after he just completely butchered Dark Tower. How does Akiva Goldsman keep getting work? That Oscar of his, he must keep it awfully shiny so it's hypnotic in meetings. All right, so next story, Mel Gibson's comeback. I'd meant to cover this yesterday. I'm sorry about that. But I have a new shooting set up, and so in my efforts to try and rig everything here and get it just right, I'm still working on it. I didn't get to cover this yesterday. My apologies, but it fits today. So Mel Gibson, who of course was persona non grata in Hollywood for quite some time, since 2010, due to some absolutely horrible things that he said and did. He was arrested, and then things just got much worse from there. But he's been inching his way back into Hollywood and audiences' good graces by doing, let's be honest, really good work, most notably Hacksaw Ridge. And as Hollywood implodes with scandals, with things that seem, I think, at least at first glance, far worse, I think, the question becomes, well, what do we do about someone like Mel Gibson, right? I mean, he said horrible things, and he believes them, but he didn't, break any laws and sexually assault people like, Harvey Weinstein has been accused of doing, and now Kevin Spacey. And we're going to talk about Kevin Spacey as well today, because that story continues to develop at lightning speed. But the question is, if someone has an attitude like Mel Gibson's, does it fuel this kind of behavior in Hollywood and get people used to accepting bad behavior as long as the professional work is good, right? So perhaps Mel Gibson it's not such a innocuous situation, right? But if you have a problem with Mel Gibson, where does the line get drawn? What about Tom Cruise? He's a Scientologist, and the wife of the leader of the Scientology movement is missing. Nobody knows where she is. Last I heard, nobody wants to look into it. Walt Disney, for instance, obviously not at the level of those two individuals, but even someone like Walt Disney, he, very much a product of his time. He's been known to make some, anti-Semitic remarks. I don't even know, but they're, let's just say derogatory. Thinking of, people, different types of people who aren't white men as, a little bit less, even women. And as a woman myself, I remember the day that I was watching the special when he was kind of like being very patronizing and talking down to a woman who was on the show with him. And I was like, oh my goodness, if I met Walt Disney, he wouldn't think very much of me. That's crazy. And so the question becomes, do I no longer like, the wonderful things that Walt Disney has done and what he's, the world that he's built and how much he's contributed to entertainment and society? And so, obviously the answer to that, as far as I'm concerned, I had to make that decision was no. And it's a personal decision for everybody. But of course, it does affect, the Hollywood business. So the question becomes, has Mel Gibson done his time, right? I mean, again, I told you it's been since 2010 that he's been offline. He just came back, I think, in earnest last year with Hacksaw Ridge. And then at first we were like, okay, well, if Mel just stays behind the camera, we can be okay with this, right? Hacksaw Ridge was an amazing film. And then I think a lot of us thought he'd be wonderful for the Suicide Squad sequel, right? Just Mel, if you just stay off camera, it'll be okay. But then, of course, he's in Daddy's Home, too. And you can tell by his increased presence as they recut new trailers that he's driving a lot of the interest in that movie. Now, it's projected to open with a good $10 million below the first one. But it has a very different type of release date. And also, I think Mark Wahlberg and Will Ferrell's stock has dropped as well. So we'll see how Daddy's Home 2 does. But the reason this is also coming up is that there are serious talks to do another Lethal Weapon movie starring Mel Gibson, Danny Glover, and Richard Donner behind the camera. And those two gentlemen, Glover and Donner, they really need a Lethal Weapon 5. But, is it worth it to work with Mel Gibson to get it? Now, I asked you guys in a poll on Twitter over the weekend, how you felt about Mel Gibson. And 49% of you said you just don't care, which is not good because that means, you just won't see his films, just because you're not interested in them. 30% felt that he'd done his time, and 21% felt that they would never forgive him. And I think that kind of reflects where his box office numbers are right now. And so it's a dilemma that we find ourselves in, which we'll revisit with the viewer question. I have a conclusion to it. But first, I want to talk about the Kevin Spacey story, which has developed significantly since we discussed it on yesterday's morning movie news. House of Cards is ending after season 6. They're saying that they were already considering, or they had already planned to end it with season 6 before this broke. But of course, the timing is not only very bad for Kevin Spacey, but it just can't possibly be a coincidence, right? I mean, I guess they were like, we better cancel it so it looks like we're not supporting him. But a lot of different people make that show. That show, while Kevin Spacey is a driving force behind it and the star of it, he's not the entire show. So to just completely abandon the show so quickly is tricky. It's tough. But they are thinking of doing spin-offs, right? And also, I have to say, House of Cards will probably never win another award again. So it's dead in the water when it comes to award season, and that's very important for television shows. So the sequel, the spin-off they're considering is Doug Stamper, his chief of staff, his cohort in many ways, and that's played by Michael Kelly. I could maybe see that, but my question is, why aren't they considering a Claire Underwood spin-off? Unless Robin Wright has said, I don't want to do it. But she seems like such an obvious choice. I mean, I think for many people, she is the equal star of the show with Kevin Spacey. There have been lots of stories that she has told herself about trying to get more power with the show. So Claire Underwood has been betrayed by her husband on the show and by Kevin Spacey in real life. I think you could spin that into a very interesting starting point for a Claire Underwood show. So I think that's clearly where they should go, and I'm surprised that's not a conversation. I think they might say they want to just get as far away as possible, but I would say that in many ways, Claire Underwood and Doug Stamper are kind of like Frank Underwood's work and housewife, right? So it's a crazy situation. All right, so anyway, the viewer question, and this is a very telling username, comes from PewDiePie Did Nothing Wrong. And of course, PewDiePie had his own scandal a couple of months ago and really changed YouTube substantially in terms of monetization, etc. So anyway, this BTC viewer asks, viewer question here. What do you think about all the backpedaling fans do when controversies come out? For instance, when the Harvey Weinstein accusations came to light, I saw many popular tweets about how his films were bad now. And the same with Kevin Spacey. People claiming American Beauty is the worst film to ever win an Oscar, and that House of Cards is crap. Like their behavior on set somehow impacts their art. It's worse with Weinstein, of course, as he is only a producer. I think what this BTT viewer is saying is that, why would you particularly hate something where the person doesn't even appear on screen? Very interesting question. And this is something we debate a lot. For instance, Mel Gibson, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I think the issue is that when you see the person after that, you just can't help but think of what they did. And it's very hard to stomach it and to support it. And you aren't meant to condone it. And I think that's a better word for this conversation. And you're doing that by watching it. You're saying, okay, I'll still consume your product, even though I know you're a despicable person personally. And I think that's, as much as, the question is whether or not you should, I think for a lot of people, you just can't. So that's why it hurts those films. And it's really tragic, for instance, a film like American Beauty to be forever marred like this. And also, I was watching the Michael Jackson Halloween special last night, and his music is just genius. And he was such an amazing dancer and such a fabulous professional. But when I see him now, I can't help but think of all the accusations and the odd behavior that he exhibited. So that's really tricky. Now, as for Harvey Weinstein, who doesn't appear on screen, I think the problem there is that watching the movie, that everybody on screen, or at least a number of people on screen or behind the camera who made the movie, they turned a blind eye to Weinstein's behavior in order to profit themselves, to get the movie that you're watching made. For instance, Scott Rosenberg, the screenwriter on Beautiful Girls, wrote a very compelling and revealing essay on Deadline right after the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, saying, we all knew, but none of us, we were just doing too well. Harvey Weinstein was doing too much for us, to basically, why would we end our own success, for something that is so rampant in Hollywood? And we're learning that. It's really horrible. So that's, I think, why people have a problem with Weinstein's films, even though he only produced him. And so the larger question that comes out of all this stuff that we've discussed today is, does really good professional behavior give one a free pass in their personal life or personal behavior? And I think this is becoming a question that no longer is avoidable with the internet and the unprecedented level of transparency that it creates. It used to be, this is nothing new again in Hollywood. And I think that's why some people in Hollywood didn't say anything, right? And also I think why some people are scratching their heads saying it's always been business as usual like this. Because, you always have some people who are going to be on the side of the conversation. Like, PewDiePie did nothing wrong. Like, it's just this is the way the world works. And it used to be that the companies that were profiting off these individuals could collude with the media and they could cover these things up. They could control the story because there were only so many media sources, and those media sources controlled all the discussion. But that's no longer the case with social media, like something like Twitter, and also then, so many news outlets. And that creates, before it was, the media could decide what they wanted to cover. But now, considering the fact that ratings and advertisers factor in so heavily into the news, they literally can't afford to do that anymore. They have to get the story and get the clicks. So that has created a situation where these things can no longer be hidden. So this is a question that's always, I think, in some ways existed when it comes to professionals and the people who consume their product. But only now is it something that people actually have to deal with. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it down below. All right, so that's today's morning movie news. Happy Halloween. Please write your thoughts down below about today's top 3 stories, the viewer question, anything you'd like to see covered tomorrow, and any questions that you might have. And have a wonderful Halloween. Bye.